Hi, welcome to the channel Coder's Arc, where we unravel the world of coding and architecture together. And today I'm going to talk about API gateways. I will show how API gateways can be integrated with the Lambda functions. I will also show how Visual Studio Toolkit can be used to deploy API gateways as serverless applications using the CloudFormation stack. We will also cover important concepts like resources, stages, cores, gateway responses, and Lambda authorizers. Now, before I dive into the hands-on tutorial, I would like to cover why API gateways are needed. A lot of the important functionality like accessing important file servers, sensitive database, CRUD operations, core business logic that is implemented using the API gateways. And API gateways is an application management service that sits between the client and these backend services. So hopefully that gives you a brief idea of what the API gateway functionality is, and let's dive right into the tutorial. And now we are on the Visual Studio 2022 homepage. From here, we will create a new serverless application. Essentially, it will be an API gateway hooked up to an AWS Lambda. We will deploy this serverless application to AWS console. And then finally, once the application is deployed, we will invoke it using Postman. So let's dive right into it. Click Create a new project. From the list of recent project templates, I will choose AWS Serverless Application with tests .NET Core C#. Click Next. Give it a meaningful name. Click Create. From here, I get a list of AWS Select blueprints. I will choose the ASP.NET Core Web API. As you can see, there are other templates like S3 function and WebSocket API, but I will choose the ASP.NET Core Web API. Click Finish. And here you can see now you get a new solution. And in this solution, there is a folder called controllers. Let's open that folder. Here is a file values controller.cs. I'm not trying to make any changes in the application logic. So I'm just going to deploy this template directly onto AWS console. So for that, I will do the publish to AWS Lambda. From here, I will choose a meaningful stack name. I will choose an already existing bucket and hit publish. So now behind the scenes, Visual Studio Toolkit uses CloudFormation to deploy the serverless application stack onto AWS. And you'll be able to view the sequence of events over here. As you can see, the create is in progress, and then you can monitor all the events that are happening over here. It is a very intuitive way to understand how Visual Studio Toolkit deploys a serverless application in the backend. So let's give it a few seconds. So now we see that the create is complete. And finally, once the entire stack is deployed, you will see that the status over here will also change to created complete. So give it a few more seconds. So now you can see it's complete. So at this point, I'm going to be logging on to AWS console and seeing what the CloudFormation stack deployed. Now I'm on the AWS console homepage. So let's navigate to API Gateway. From here, I can see that my method was deployed successfully. Let's click on that method. And here, if you dig closely by clicking on resources, you will see that the Lambda function is actually integrated with my API gateway. So this is a visual way that your client would be making a call to the API gateway, and through the API gateway and Lambda integration request, the actual payload will go to the Lambda function, and from the Lambda function processing the method, you will get the integration response, and that will be returned back to the client. So this is a good visual way to understand how the flow of payload happens from client to API gateway to the Lambda function and back to the client. So one of the important things is that you explicitly click the deploy API. From here, you can select the stage, hit deploy, and finally, this API is now ready to use. So let's look at the URL. This is the invoke URL that we have received. So now let's use Postman to make a call on this endpoint. So now I'm on the Postman, and from here I will create a new API request to my endpoint. Let me copy this URL, click create, add a request, copy that URL over here. Now let's look at the code real quick to make sure we're calling the right endpoint. And I want to call the first basic endpoint, which is the API/values. Let me copy this and append it to the staging URL. And click send. And as you can see, I'm getting the value 1 and value 2, which was, if you look back at the code, this is the output that I was expecting. Now let's look at the CloudWatch logs one more time to make sure we are getting the right Lambda called. So let's go to Lambda. From here, let me go to my function, click on monitor, go to CloudWatch logs, and click on the log stream. And you can see that the method was called. So let's look at the request coming over here. So the request came over here, as you can see, coders arg API gateway method controllers values controller was called, and the get endpoint was called over here. And you can see that the execution of the endpoint was successful. So one more time, I would like to emphasize what we saw is an API gateway integrated with Lambda and how you can call from your client to get the expected output. So in this video, we covered how AWS API gateways work with the AWS Lambda functions. We also covered how Visual Studio Toolkit uses the CloudFormation stack to deploy AWS API gateways onto the AWS console. We also covered how resources and stages work, essentially how a payload is transferred from client to the API gateway to the Lambda function, and the response is returned from Lambda function to the API gateway all the way back to the client. In the concept of stages, we can replicate production, staging, dev, and QA environments. We also want to cover the concept of authorizer and gateway responses very briefly. Authorizer is a way to secure the endpoints. Essentially, some of the very critical and crucial functionality can be implemented behind the API gateway endpoints, and you want to make sure that unauthorized users are not accessing that functionality. For example, accessing a database or files in the backend. So to prevent that, we have authorizers, and authorizer is nothing but a piece of functionality or piece of code that can be implemented inside the Lambda method, where you take the access token passed to the endpoints and validate that JWT token against the identity provider that generated that token. Once the token is validated, then you are allowed access to the Lambda function. Another important concept is gateway responses. The API gateways can tailor the gateway responses the standard gateway responses according to how the client application needs it. And finally, there is the concept of enabling the cores, which is the cross-origin resource sharing. And I think that's all the content that I wanted to cover in this brief video. If you found the value in this content useful, please hit the subscribe and like button. For now, goodbye.